I want to talk to you a little bit about the designer series and what inspired it. A few years ago at Ted Hood's memorial service, I was struck by the broad impact that his career had on so many, as a designer, as a builder, engineer, and just larger than life figure. Following that, I thought it'd be interesting to replicate the experience that we had at the memorial service, the collection of boat owners, those who worked in the industry, who worked alongside him, both designing and building, by picking out additional designers and witnessing those who have been affected, their lives have been affected by that designer, either through working with them, sailing them, building them, etc. Today, we're kicking off what will be 12 months of lead up to our on the water experience, where we hope to have boats that have been designed by Sparkman and Stevens over the years, big, small, modern, classic, power sail, and we're very excited about that opportunity. So over the next 12 months, we hope to partner with other events, Classic Yacht Symposium, other events that we want to bring focus on design to. So I thank you for coming here tonight to kick off the next 12 months, and I also invite you to mark your calendars for the event next June. So, Louis, you want to get started and introduce our panelists?
Sure. Well, I want to welcome you all. A lovely day. This is Newport at its best, and the drive down from Wenham, Mass. was delightful, completely wonderful. And I really am very, very honored to be here. Wait a minute, I just dropped something. I think I'll just hold it in my hand. My wife says I should hold it. I will. Now, without further ado, let me thank Clark for getting me into this thing, Clark Poston, and Carol Beecher for hounding me day by day, and Jay Peacock, who's an old friend and who's responsible for all the good questions in this pile of manuscript here and takes none of the blame. Welcome to a Sparkman and Stevens design discussion. My name is Llewellyn Howland. I am an antiquated antiquarian bookseller and yachting historian. Wisely or otherwise, the organizers of the Designer Series have asked me to moderate what they plan as the first of an ongoing program of events devoted to the history and practice of American yacht design. I note that it is now, my goodness gracious, it is now 3:30. I was planning on 3:05, 3:30. And that today's panel consists not just of the 5 Sparkman and Stevens veterans originally announced, but of S&S's but also of S&S old boy Paul Buttrose, the legendary yacht broker and no-tour Swan veteran. So 6 panelists, 1 moderator, and 115 minutes to survey the 89-year history of Sparkman and Stevens, as represented by nearly 3,000 individual designs, reflecting input from more than 275 naval architects, yacht designers, marine engineers, draftspeople, inkers, mathematicians, sailing wizards, among them 2 remarkable brothers, Olin and Rod Stevens, who both could fairly be said to have had a hand in every design and every successful boat produced by Sparkman and Stevens during their active years together with the firm and long after. Before we begin discussions, I ask the panel members to introduce themselves very briefly. And I must ask you to be equally short-winded as the panel discussion continues. We all want, in the worst way, to hear what you have to tell us. We don't want to have to hold the show, to fold the show at 5, well, it would be 5 or 5:30, with the program half finished. And as for questions from the floor, points from the floor, I don't know, it's too early to tell. At 5:30, we'll review that matter. Now, I think I'd like to go in order of of some kind of seniority. I'd like to really start with Halsey because I've known Halsey the longest. I've known him since 1954 when we won the Annapolis race together. And am I to give him this? Oh, he's got one. All right. And Halsey will begin with an introduction of his life, and then we will move on, and I'll introduce each
You want me
one.
to come there?
Halsey,
Sure, why?
I think maybe this is it here.
Sure, that would be.
Okay.
I don't know if it's on though.
I think it is. Well, thank you very much, Louis, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I have been always great admirers of Sparkman and Stevens, and not only of their signal accomplishments in the profession of yacht design, but also for their amazingly fine characters of integrity, optimism, energy, and great work ethic. I always knew them as a young man through my connections with my own family. They used to visit my father Sidney's model room of a lot of the Herreshoff boats, and they were always totally cordial and friendly and glad to be there. And then I got to know them much better when I was a student at Webb Institute and worked there briefly in their office. And then finally, I was so pleased to be a member of the crew of the Columbia in the 1958 America's Cup. And that's when I developed an amazing admiration for Rod Stevens, for his seamanship and energy and application of picking the right sails. And today, when I'm doing things on my boat with a bunch of young crew around, I say, I learned that from Rod Stevens. And some of them will say, Rod who? And I said, you mean to say you're 23 years old and you don't know who Rod Stevens was? He was the greatest yachting seaman of all. Most significantly, I think, right after World War II, when a lot of new sailors came in, and a lot of the tricks that we take automatically in the back of our minds were developed by Rod Stevens. And of course, Olin had not only a different set of talents, being a great designer he was, but Rod one time told me that of all the people he ever sailed with, Olin was the most objective in deciding whether to crowd on sail or when to take it off, and that he would make decisions totally on the objective analysis of what the boat was doing without any regard whatsoever about the discomfort of the crew or whatever they were going to do, which is what, of course, we all should do if we want to win, particularly an ocean race. The third important member of the Sparkman Stevens organization, which I think probably Dave's going to speak more about, was a man whose name isn't nearly as well known, Gil Wyland. Gil Wyland was a graduate of the famous and prestigious Webb Institute of Naval Architecture, as both Dave and I are. And he was, I think, a consummate engineer that the company needed, because with Olin's emphasis on the lines of the boat and the overall performance, and Rod's emphasis upon the rigs and sail plans and all of the things that go with the management of the sailing, Wyland was in the back room working out that things wouldn't break and that they'd be strong enough, and solving the basic problem of a naval architect engineer to make something that's strong but light. Before passing this on, because I know we're kind of in a hurry, I'm just going to mention a couple of the rare occurrences that I had with these gentlemen. First of all, I became so much a friend of Olin Stevens that 2 or 3 of my friends and I took him to lunch the day before he turned 100 years old. And he recalled conversations between himself and me from like 40 years back, and he remembered them a lot better than I did. He also came to the lunch there at nearly 100 years old with his latest girlfriend from the place where he lived up in New Hampshire, which was impressive. With Rod, I sailed a lot, not only on the 12 meters, but also in Bermuda races and Lock Island races and all. And we cruised to Nova Scotia. And there, he introduced me to Captain Angus Walters. You may not know who that is, but Angus Walters was the champion of the fishing boat races. And by that time, he was about 95, running a chicken farm. But the significance of that was that when, with the help of their father, Rod and Olin built the Dorade and won the transatlantic race from here to Europe, to England, it was Angus Walters that they had met through a mutual friend that told them about the virtues of going way north for more wind, good Gulf Stream. And even though Dorade was a superb boat at the time, they won that race a lot because of what Angus Walters had told them. And that just goes to the point that for success with yachts, you not only need a great design, a great build, and good sailors, but don't believe you know everything, and get advice from the right people. Thank you.
Thank you, Halsey. That's great. That's an amazing story about Angus. All right, well, you've been timely, and I hope your fellow panelists will be as observant. And I'm not sure whether to call on David Pedrick yet or Andy MacGowan. I'll let them fight it out.
Let me do my
Age before beauty or pearls before swine.
I'm going to take your stand there because I have a couple of crib
Sure.
notes in that I'm famous for running overtime, and I'm going to try very hard not to do that today. I just, is this working, folks? Yeah, that's
Yep.
great. Okay, great. Thanks, Halsey. By the way, I've sailed a lot with Halsey and a lot with David and a little bit with Paul, I think, in my career, so it's kind of fun to be back together. I'm not a naval architect. I'm not a mathematician. I don't belong anywhere near these guys. I'm just a sailor. I met Olin for the first time personally in 1970 when I sailed here in the Valiant Weatherly program. And we lived together at 300 Gibbs Avenue here in Newport, and we've struck up a friendship. And it didn't hurt that Weatherly was the sort of surprise boat of the summer in that she almost sank at the mooring the winter before, and because of the design failures from tank testing, which David will tell you all about, we were second in the July trials and second in the June trials, which wasn't supposed to happen. At the end of the summer, I got a call. I was back living in Marina del Rey, California, and Olin said, how about coming back and being assistant to Rod and I at the firm? I had no idea what that meant, and I'm going to try and share a few of my remembrances and thoughts here when I arrived the first week of October of 1970 to an office that had a pile of file cabinets in the middle of it. It was at 79 Madison Avenue, 28th Street and Madison Avenue. The walls were sort of a World War II pea green. The floors were unwaxed or overwaxed, one or the other, linoleum. There were the file cabinets were all World War II. You know, it was really an early version of what we all saw in the 70s and 80s and 90s with the new generation coming. This was a loft workspace. It had 3 offices up on the front, one for Rod, one for the bookkeeper, and one for Olin. And there was one small conference room just inside the door from the lobby outside. It was, what floor, David? 28th or something like that? Or?
12th floor. I think it
12th
was.
floor, okay.
Yeah.
See, Rod ran them every day, and I took the elevator with Olin and David, and I always thought that was an intelligence test. But anyway, we got to know each other. I had no idea why I was there, really. I knew enough about sailing and boating at that time that I knew where I was, but I didn't know really why I was there. And, you know, it was remarkable that the character of the people that invited me to go to work for them were so generous with their time. I loved, can you imagine going to lunch every day for 6 years, for about 6 months of each year, because the rest of the time I was on a boat or on a race course or in a shipyard someplace representing them. But every day we were in the office, we had the lunch across the street with David and I and Bill Mavrionis and 2 or 3 of the key lead designers. And we talked boats. And what a wonderful thing that was. I've reflected so many times on the discussions of what was fast and why was it fast, or what was slow and how to get faster. And they were very, very, very keen. They took in, they listened intently. I really wasn't sure what the value of what my input was or wasn't, but I was never shunned from giving it, never told you don't understand, never told back off. Hey, someday when you grow up and you learn how to do a checkbook, we'll listen to you. But, you know, it was remarkable how the input flowed. Funny. Those were great days. We had a wonderful gang in the office. There were very talented people. There were 15 tables down the sunny side of the office floor space. And the draftsmen that occupied those tables were the guys that actually drew the lines and made the plans. And it was remarkable, the business format of Rod Nolan. They were calm, they were encouraging, they were supportive, they were interested, they always listened, never a loud or explosive moment in the office. Consistency was a real word. As Halsey was saying, you know, Rod was by the book. He knew, he had gathered from all over the world, from the greatest shipyards, the greatest sailors. As a young man, Nevins, Renneford, Herreshoff, he had gathered these tricks and these things that he believed in deeply, and he poured them into his boats. And so you had this sort of bifurcation where you had Olin and the naval architects drawing and laying out boats that they thought were going to be from a lines plan, from a wetted surface, stability, length, beam, all of the criteria for what they thought was the way to go at the time. And then on the other side of the house, you had a man dedicated to making sure that that boat was a Sparkman and Stevens boat. And those details, we call them Rodisms, they were hated. And I see Buttrose putting his head down, because they were actually what made Nautor Swan so famous in its day, and what was at the root of its success, in my opinion. In the boat building world, we went through the transition from wood to fiberglass, and the production boat builders loved telling customers, you don't need that. And yet at a Sparkman Stevens yacht, if you bought a fiberglass Sparkman Stevens yacht from Nautor, you got all of Rod's knowledge from everything he had ever done in his life. And what a tremendous, powerful sales tool that was. What a wonderful thing it was to have in the boat. I'm going to read you a few of these things quickly, just to show you the kind of thinking that was going on in his mind. I left in '76 to help form the Enterprise Syndicate with Ed and Rich DeMoulin. And of course, we immediately employed Olin and the team to design the boat. And of course, our friends at Miniford built the boat, which was old homework by them for us, which we loved. And I think one of my proudest moments in my life was at the end of the July series. Olin pulled me aside and he said, "You've done it. You've got a faster boat." So, because Courageous was certainly a wonderful benchmark, and that was David's baby, and so was Enterprise. And of course, Halsey won the America's Cup on Courageous. So I'm just going to do sort of a, what do you call it when you, stream of thought.
We don't have too much more.
Okay, I'll blow it right off here. Stream of thought. These are, for people who own Sparkman and Stevens yachts, you know about cockpit drainage, companionway leak-proof dodgers, leak-proof hatches, mast partner details, quadrant and shiv alignment. I go on and on and on. These were in a book. Rod created a book of type plans. He had the drawings made, he numbered them, they were dated, they went to every single yard that built a boat for Sparkman and Stevens, and it better have this attention to detail in that boat, or Rod wasn't going to say it was a Sparkman and Stevens yacht. And I'll shut up for now, but I'm very good at a bar. So if you have any questions or would like to know any more of these things, my wife is here. She can answer because she's heard all the stories before. So thank you very much.
That's great. And by the way, you just saved a lot of time because a lot of these things, I didn't know whether they were going to get covered or not. You've covered them. Thank you. Now, I think David, if you're willing, it's a tough act to follow.
Yeah.
David, the microphone's here.
Yeah, is this wired mic working? Is this mic working?
Yes.
Okay. I'll, if it doesn't, I'll pick up the handheld. But there's so much to say in so little time, so I'm going to lean on my notes for this also. But there are some pretty interesting aspects of how the company was and some of the characteristics of the way the company operated. But I'll begin with a few points about how I fit into the S&S story. A Webb Institute internship in the S&S office led to a job offer on graduating from Webb Institute. And I was brought in as the assistant to the chief engineer, but grew into becoming the chief of research and development for the leading edge projects. And then after 7 exciting and fulfilling years at 79 Madison Avenue, I left in 77 to fend for myself here in Newport. My awareness of S&S began in 1958 as a 10-year-old kid sailing shallow water boats in Barnegat Bay, New Jersey. I was intrigued by articles about Columbia and Vim, which were duking it out in the America's Cup trials. Little could I foresee ever setting foot on one of these Grand 12s, or how one of the sailors named Halsey would figure into my life. A summer neighbor was a commercial naval architect with a passion for sailing craft. That jump-started me to pursue a similar path. While becoming a big ship naval architect and marine engineer at Webb, I also progressed in my avocation of sailing yacht design. Thanks to the shared Webb connection, Halsey opened up a major door for me. In short, he arranged for the internship at S&S that started my yacht design career. So now about the design side of Sparkman and Stevens. S&S was by far the world's most dominant yacht design firm for a half a century. Before the global competition of talented new designers opened up the marketplace in the 1970s. The size of the design office is hard to imagine now, with more than 30 people when I started there. About half were draftsmen and engineers, a quarter were the senior partners and middle managers, and a quarter were secretaries and some people in such archaic roles as the plug-in switchboard operator. Our file manager, in its pre-computer meaning, was a person who commanded a library of drawers and tubes of drawings that had to be requested and signed out. While attribution for the firm's success is commonly given to Llewellyn, he always instructed the press to credit the company and not him personally. The company was led by a 3-man team for almost its entire first half-century. The Stevens brothers, Llewellyn and Rod, had a distinct sharing of design roles. Llewellyn was the design visionary from the shear line down. Rod was the hands-on seaman and practical designer from the deck up. Rod was was also the principal field representative for the company, especially in Europe. The third member of the triumvirate that Halsey described was Gil Wyland, chief engineer, who joined the firm in the mid-1930s for the Ranger project and led the firm's engineering and technical work for 40 more years. The drafting room was run on a day-to-day basis by a design manager, Bill Mavrianis, during my years there. There were a few project managers for larger individual jobs and a customer field representative, Andy Mack, during my time, to back up Rod's client support. I was one of 2 naval architects to support Llewellyn and Gil. An unsung member of the Stevens family was Rod Sr. He took care of his boys' careers, beginning with the commissioning of Dorade's design in the second year of S&S. And in his later years, while we were there, taking care of the company's publicity until his death in the mid-1970s. While Llewellyn was deliberate about promoting the S&S brand, and not himself, he similarly avoided crediting other individuals within the firm. The company's success depended on the team effort, but of course it was certainly due to Llewellyn's primary talent and leadership with Rod and Gil in essential supporting roles. In 2004, I presented a tribute to Llewellyn in Castine, Maine as part of the 75th anniversary summer of S&S. It was built around a series of topics that I can only list for now. Happy to talk about them more later. 3 primary qualities highlight Llewellyn's sense of design: intuition, science, and aesthetics. The strength of the S&S office came through Owen's commitment to teamwork and trust in his design team. Among his other personal and professional qualities were intellectual honesty, a passion for yacht design, generous leadership of volunteer technical committees, humility with a gentle sense of humor, and always confidence. I'll finish with two brief stories that show these last few points. In 1967, Constellation and Intrepid were both racing on a windy afternoon, and they both lost their rigs. Intrepid's dismasting was due to an aluminum spreader with aggressively large lightning holes. Owen and the afterguard were discussing the rig failure in the crew house later when one of the wives came by and picked up the crumpled spreader. When she said, "Gee, this is really light," Owen replied, "Well, Mary, under other circumstances, I'd consider that a compliment." A few years later, I was with him when someone asked if he ever patented his designs. Owen said, "No, their patents are too easy to work around and too much bother. Besides," he added, "if someone is copying your work, that's just where you want them, behind you." So finishing on that night, thank you to the organizers and colleagues for this afternoon's stories about S&S and more to come.
That's good. That is great, David. And again, I can drop another topic that I was worried whether it was going to get covered or not. So we're moving along a little faster and better than I'd hoped. Paul Buttrose.
Well, I thought I'd be last because I really am the interloper. The only design work I've ever done was the deck layout for the Swan 76, an S&S design, and that was about 40 years ago. Regardless, I first met Olin and Rod when I was sailing on Running Tide, one of their finest boats, in my opinion, they ever built. And then I continued on Yankee Girl and went across the Atlantic for the Admiral's Cup with her in '71 and got to know them quite well. And just seemed to always be running into S&S designs and thoroughly enjoyed sailing on their boats. Fast forward a few years later, I was working for a gentleman in San Francisco. He had originally he was one of the owners of Maruna. And in fact, he and Tim Mosley, who owned Orient, the two men who founded Barrion, because Orient and Maruna used to sail in San Francisco Bay, and they could never come up with what they thought was the ideal way of holding up the mast. So instead of a high-field lever, they decided to form Barrion and built winches. Anyway, he had, Jim Michael was the man, he had a good relationship with Olin, and being from San Francisco, he watched Bill Lee and all those surfboard boys down in Santa Cruz develop what was called an ultralight displacement boat in the late 60s. And of course, at that point I was sailing on Windward Passage, and we thought, well, that boat won't even last 10 minutes out of Los Angeles. Well, sure enough, on Transpac, they got down there in 9 days and broke our record by about 2.5 days. So Jim had the idea that he needed an ultralight displacement boat. So he went to Olin and said, I've got this great idea. I want you to design for me an ultra-fast boat, light. And I think we can pick up our stability with form rather than having a big lead package. And incidentally, I want the headroom to be 6'7". Jim was a tall man. Not only that, he said, I've decided I'd like to build it in Maine. So as I was the project guy, and then imagine going to an old Maine boat builder, namely Paul Luke, and saying, Paul, would you mind lightening this up a little? He's from Maine. He's been building beautiful wooden boats and decent boats. In fact, Fred Van Loo is here somewhere. He has a beautiful Paul Luke boat, and that was not built lightly. So at one meeting with Olin, Jim said, look, Olin, if this boat is a success, you can take all the credit. But if it fails, I'll take the blame. And Olin looked at him and said, well, Jim, you know, it won't work that way. I'll be blamed either way. Well, sure enough, as the great Tom Blackwell, who did the sails and sailed with us, in fact, Andy sailed with us on that boat, after a dismal performance in Florida, the SORC, Tom said, this dog refuses to hunt. It just didn't work. It was not the right thing. And unfortunately, well, actually the boat sank, as I recall years later. Anyway, it was most unsuccessful. Then a short while later, I was asked to become involved with Nautor in Finland because of my experience on maxi boats to do a deck layout, which I thought was unusual. Being a Sparkman and Stevens design, they were consulting with someone from the outside. And so I went to Finland in January of 1980, I think it was, or 79, maybe 79. Never seen snow in my life, and arrived in Pietarsaari, Finland in the middle of January. And so they said, there's the job, we want a deck layout for this Swan 76. And Rod came over and did not interfere for a minute. He greeted me warmly, and he stayed away from the deck layout. And at that time, Bill Langan had just been appointed Chief Designer, and I met him over there. And the project went quite well. Obviously, I plagiarized a lot of things from Windward Passage because she was such a successful boat with a good pedigree. And shortly after that, I was appointed Nautor agent for the Finns here, and I opened an office here in 1980. And that was the time when Ron Holland had come along, Doug Peterson had come along with his half-tonners and two-tonners, Ron with IMP. And we were seeing the demise on the race course of S&S designs. They were still out there in boats that had sort of come along from CCA, going to IOR, Running Tide, Charisma, Yankee Girl. They were very strong boats, but we gradually saw Holland and Peterson and then Frères come along with boats that were winning on the race course. And as an agent over there were, I think, 7 of us worldwide. We'd have several meetings a year over there. And they would ask our opinion on what boat we should be marketing next. The most successful Swan ever designed was a Swan 38 by Sparkman and Stevens. They sold 116 boats. Huge success. But Ron Holland was appointed to do the 371 as a replacement. A nice boat, and sold about 80 models. Then he did the 42, the 441, and then Frères, because of the success of Blizzard and Acadia, they gave him the Swan 51 design. So we saw less and less of S&S as the Nautor years went on. I stayed with Nautor through about 93, I think it was. And then I joined him on Frères. And I've got a couple of stories that are pivotal for me in my life, but the last one being when I sailed with Olin and on his last race. But prior to that, Frères and I got together, and I was with him for 5 years. And during that period, we kept saying, what's happening at S&S? And so, as you can tell, I'm not a designer, but sometimes I sell stuff. And I sold him on the idea of buying S&S and establishing a beachhead for him in Manhattan. So I approached Mitch, and Herman approached Olin, and they thought that was a great idea. But Mitch did say, unless all the stockholders would agree, then they wouldn't do it. And so I remember sitting in the office, Madison Abbey, or you just moved, I think, by then, with Greg Matzak, who's not here. And I tried to explain that, Karl Lagerfeld in design, just because he joined Dior, didn't do anything to Dior. Dior carried on, it's still a famous name, and Herman wasn't going to change the name. He wanted to leave it as Sparkman and Stevens, but he would be behind it. And if Greg, I could still tell the story, Greg was a bit upset that he would be pushed aside. And I said, well, all due respects, but if we walk down Fifth Avenue today, Herman would be recognized. Someone would come up and say hello, but Greg, I'm sorry, you don't cut it. Anyway, that fell apart, and one person didn't want to make the change, and so that was the end of that. And then my final story, I facilitated the sale of Dorade several times. And Olin's last race happened to be on Dorade in the Museum of Yachting event in 2006, I think it was. And he sailed with us, and on the first day, he said, after the first day, he said, you boys didn't get that mizzen up quickly enough. And the next day we did, and the mizzen mast came down with it. That was Olin's last race, and also Mitch Neff's last race. He passed away about 8 months later. And Meanwhile, current time now, I'm a broker with Sparkman and Stevens, so I'm still involved. Thank you to everybody for organising this.
Thank you, Paul. Mr. Teeters, could you come up, please? I present you with this award.
Thank you. Is this working?
Jim Teeters.
I'm Jim Teeters. My first experience with Sparkman and Stevens was in Annapolis, Maryland at the Chesapeake Sailing Yacht Symposium, where I was kind of a young guy, and I went to see the symposium, and one David Pedrick was giving a presentation which I thought was fascinating. So I went to Sparkman and Stevens and talked to them, and they said go back to school. I went to Stevens Institute of Technology and got a master's degree, and then got hired in 1981 for the 1983 America's Cup campaign. My job was tank test analysis, performance prediction, and as you might all remember, 1983 was the first year the United States lost the America's Cup. Now, I don't take credit for that, but I mention it also because, as you all know, that was the first year of the wing keel that showed up on design. And that change, that technological change, is symbolic of everything that happened in the world of racing boat design from the 1980s on. And I'm sure some of you who were around before can remember other sea changes and how things were managed, whether it was wood to plastic to aluminum or whatever. But in terms of the design process, this was the beginning of a massive change in how we did things. Technology was brought in. That wing keel was the result of using aerospace technology, computational methods that would run on supercomputers to evaluate whatever it was about the design. And this launched a revolution in how we did design just for everything else, all the other boats. We had rudimentary velocity prediction programs at that time, courtesy of the Pratt project, and I know S&S had something proprietary of their own. VPPs, the velocity prediction programs, took off. Computational fluid dynamics became a part of high performance design on a regular basis. And for someone like myself, it was a fantastic opportunity because my background is math and science, along with a love of sailboats. And for me, I got to be the interface between traditional design and the incoming technologies. And sometimes I was implementing the technology, sometimes I was writing code that would do methods. I got to work with a lot of fascinating people, both Bill Langan, who was chief designer, and Llewellyn, carrying on a tradition that they had done for many years, and one of you referred to it, was support of offshore handicapping, or whatever it was that helped the industry. They would volunteer their time. And they mentored me in doing the same thing. So I had a career at Sparkman and Stevens of being not only farmed out to America's Cup campaigns, whether the office itself were involved or not, but I got roped into working on the IMS rule and other handicap rules. I joined the International Technical Committee. David Pedrick and I had some great years working there together, working on solving the problems of making offshore racing more equitable and easier. It was a fantastic experience for me. Before I go any further, I'd like to interject an anecdote that I wasn't thinking about until one of you mentioned the lunch crowd. I believe that was the Prince George Hotel. Thank you. I didn't really go there. The old guard went, so there was Rod Owen, who was retired, would come in once in a while. Hank Yulee, Frank Kinney. I think Mario was sipping his homemade soup for lunch at his desk, but there was a crowd that would go over there every day. I joined them one day, and we all sat down, and the waitress came up, and she looked at Rod, and he said, "The usual." And then she looked at Frank, and he said, "The usual." And it went around the table, and everyone was saying, "The usual." I didn't know what the usual was. But each one had their own usual, and she knew everything. I probably ordered an omelet, not knowing what was going on. A couple years later, I went and joined them for lunch, and they hadn't realized that this had become a welfare hotel. So we could look out the window, and every now and then there was a smoke coming out, and fire engines racing up because people were trying to make do cooking in their hotel rooms. Ultimately, the guys finally realized that it wasn't really the right place for them anymore. The whole thing was going into ruins around them. And we took them out to a Chinese luncheon. And some of them had never had Chinese food in their lives. So, a lot of transitions. One of them was that I wrote the code where we had a mathematical surface that represented hulls and keels and rudders. Now, you all know, and one of you described it, there were these big boards, and they were actually sagging a little bit in the middle. But there was paper spread out. They had their flexible pieces of plastic or favorite pieces of wood called splines, and they were held in place by duck weights, or duck spline weights, yes. And they would draw all the curves and various different views that all had to agree with each other. It was an art, and these guys were all artists. And they took great pride in what they did, and Owen and Rod and the others depended very much on these guys to draw something that was aesthetically beautiful. It would have the right displacement and length and draft and everything else. My job was to replace them with a computer. So I was very popular at that time, and what I did initially was took what they did and I would loft it, bring it into a computer. They drew it, I locked it in, and then we do the calculations, which greatly speed up our analysis. But ultimately, yes, I created the software, and a number of other people were doing it, and all modern designers now, well, I believe all modern designers use software. So they have surfaces that they can see on the computer screen. But I can tell you it's not the same thing as drawing on a long piece of board with splines and spline weights, because they would draw something, they'd walk around, and they'd get down there and eyeball that thing, yeah, that looks fair, and then they'd draw another line and go around and look at it. And it's just 8 feet, 6 feet long, whatever the scope they were using. And they really had a great idea of what that boat looked like. You don't see it the same way on a computer screen. It's a nice 3D model, but you cannot tell how fair it is, how smooth the shape is. So I was given the task of making sure that what I was doing would be just as fair as what they did. And that was a great restriction to be put on me as this transition person to make sure that I could replicate the quality of what these artists were doing. And it took me a lot of time to get a computer code that would give me the kind of feedback. And Bill Langan and I would work together on all of these things.
Can I just add something right on this?
Please.
No, for you. How
You want the mic?
did you deal with the shear? Because not one yacht ever left a board ready to go to a yard without Olin approving the shear. And that was, right, David, the last kiss off was for Olin to visit the board and cite the shear and accept the shear. And there was the shear and the boot top and the cove, and that was Olin's final. So how did you do that?
That's a great question. I'll bring up another anecdote. I did heresy. I turned art into numbers. So we digitized, brought into the computer, all those shears. We looked at them in profile and in plan view, and we'd rotate them. And I would get a curvature distribution map. So I could represent your greatest aesthetics with a curve of numbers. Now, that's why I call it heresy.
Bolero or running tide?
Well, we looked at a lot of boats, and we could rotate them over in the computer and see what that shape looked like to a horizontal line as the boat heeled over. So we tabulated what made a good-looking boat, and what was it about the shear that would do that.
The other thing in the office that you must have, which is where the power really must have helped the most, was the heeled water lines, the development of the heeled water lines, which was Olin's also one of his. He'd come at the right moment when the first finished set of lines was sort of available to view, and then he would ask for a heeled water line, 2 or 3 heeled water lines, 10 degrees, 20 degrees, 30 degrees, and then he would cite those as well. And that was magic stuff. Right?
And having a creation inside of a computer allows you to do that in a couple seconds. You don't have to measure and draw. You heel the boat over, calculate a water line, and with a curvature map like I was talking about, you can judge what's on the screen, whereas you can't walk sideways on a screen and take a look at it and judge fairness. But you can look at a curvature map if you know what kind of curvatures represent good aesthetic design.
Well, that traditionally was dealt with on the loft floor.
Yeah.
All right.
Just the other thing I wanted to talk about was mentoring. Owen had spent a lot of time working on the ITC, International Technical Committee, working on the ORR rule and then the IMS rule. And I got roped into that after one of the CUP campaigns and joined the US IMS committee and then the technical committee of the ORC, as I mentioned, working with David and others. And that's really where I found what I wanted to do. I wasn't really interested in doing weight estimates on boats. That's a very tedious procedure, and I liked the engineering, but it wasn't really what I was about. But these guys gave me the opportunity to find out what my passion was, and I didn't know what it was. But it was the science that underlies the performance of sailboats. And I have turned that into a career. I was at Sparkman and Stevens for 16 years. I left for an America's Cup campaign and came up with Bill Langan to start a new business. But ultimately, I was tasked with creating a new rule to be used in this country, a velocity prediction rule. It was derivative of MHS IMS, but it went off into a different direction. So I left yacht design per se because I wanted to work full-time on rule development. So I did a hitch at US Sailing and then left to work full-time on the Offshore Racing Association. And we're just launching the third rule that I've created in collaboration with other people, of course. And all I can say is working with Olin, going to many meetings, the rule working party in 2004 to create a new Grand Prix rule, which didn't work out for political reasons, but these guys were amazing. Their commitment to the sport, volunteering their time and my time, of course they paid me a salary, but their commitment to making the sport better for sailors was, I think, unparalleled. And at that point, I'd like to hand it off.
That's great. Thank you very, very much, Jim. And Brendan.
Thanks, Louis. So I was born, I think, after most of you guys finished working. But my introduction to SNS was my parents purchased a Tartan 10 sailboat that we sailed out of in the mouth of the Niagara River on Lake Ontario growing up. I remember my dad had wanted some plans and he called the office in New York, and Mitch Neff was kind enough to send the plans to our house, and it was interesting, to engage an old boat like that and provide the service to an old client. I think it meant a lot to my dad. So through high school we were sailing, a lot of sailing on the lakes, and I was thinking of things to do for my life, for my career, and I was applied and accepted to Webb Institute. And I graduated from Webb, but before I graduated, actually, David Pedrick was nice enough to teach a small craft design course at school, so that was a nice introduction to the yacht design field. I also met my wife at Webb, and she's also a naval architect, and she was an intern at Sparkman and Stevens when we were in college. But during college, Greg Matsat, who was the president and chief naval architect at the time, invited my whole class to SNS in New York, and we were able to see the office with the same World War II filing cabinets and the same drafting tables with the bowed tops. And it was interesting. The office at that time was 529 Fifth Avenue. And after I graduated, I was looking for work and had a nice chats with Greg and Bruce, and ended up taking a job in New York. And when I started at SNS, the focus of the firm had changed quite a bit. There was not a lot of, the in-depth racing analysis. It was really more focused on yacht design. And my career so far has really been focused on kind of modern classic sailing yacht design. Custom yacht design, custom element design, things like that. I've also had the opportunity to work on some interesting refit projects of old S&S boats, which has been interesting. But my focus is really has been on trying to bring modern techniques to classic yacht design, and I think we've done a good job of it. And the Morris Yacht Series was a very successful run of boats, almost 150 boats. And it's been very rewarding. I also had the opportunity to design and project manage a custom boat built up in Maine, which I think was a great project, epitomized the kind of the modern classic, bringing modern design philosophy to classic aesthetic. So that's been great. But I think one thing, the guys have talked about is the firm was, they had a lot of different people doing a lot of different things, engineers and draftsmen. When I joined, it was a lot smaller, and it has gotten smaller since. And that's kind of expected of each of us, and has been through my whole time at S&S. So my background is very math and physics based, but I'm also, I do a lot of artwork and focus on aesthetics and detailed design. All this stuff is modeled in the computer, and I think we do a pretty good job. I have a 6-foot TV, so I can look sideways. But it's the same philosophy. We balance art and performance still today, maybe a little bit of a different application. There's a good slide to pop up now. The focus, lately, I think the motor yacht market is really dominating the yacht design field, and we are trying to work ourselves into that a little bit better. I remember, I don't know who the conversation was with, but at some point with somebody at S&S, they asked, do you guys even do power boats? And I think somebody looked through the history of the designs, and about 50% of the designs have been power boats. It's just been more famous for the sailboats. So that's going to be a bigger and bigger presence in the company is motor yacht design. What else can I tell you? I have met Llewellyn Stevens a few times. The first time I met him was at the 75th anniversary of the company. He was just a gentle guy, easy to talk to. Came by the office a few times when I worked in Manhattan, and I didn't know him like these guys did. But he was obviously an amazing person that developed an unbelievable company, and proud to work there today and carry things on.
Excellent. Actually, this entire audience is going to see an extraordinary event. An entire program has really been very nicely handled by the panelists without there being a panel discussion. Now, that's pretty good. And I really think I'm going to reorient my approach right now, because I've really learned, I've gotten from you what I hoped by hard work I would be able to get from you without having to do a damn thing. There are just a few things. I was going to suggest a 10 or 15-minute discussion of Rod and Olin. I'd say that's been done pretty well. I really do. I think that the books, Limes, You Are First, The Best of the Best, they're all available. But people in this room are learning stuff for the first time. But there's one thing none of you, probably, well, a few of you might know. Olin Stevens was the worst driver who ever trod on the pedal. I drove with him over to a boat show one day in his Volkswagen, and I'm surprised that I'm still alive. And I drove with him another day, and we made it home. It's amazing. He was the most aggressive driver I've ever seen him. He never swore, and he was just kept right there with the bow right to the stern of the boat ahead of him. So that's something you should know. What I'd like to do, as I was trying to figure topics, we've really touched a lot of really very important things. One thing we really haven't discussed, we've mentioned some names, certainly Herman Freyers. We haven't mentioned Gary Mull, but I want to throw out a few names right away that we should talk about in a little more depth. I've got them here somewhere. If I can find this, I didn't expect to have to retrieve it in quite this way. But, well, let's, Mario Tarabacchia, for example, one, Hank Yulee for another. I don't think any of you probably ever worked, did you, with Al Mason? Did you?
I missed him, he was gone when I got it.
But he was important when he was there. And there are others.
Don't forget Frank Kinney.
And dear Frank Kinney, lovely, lovely man. I would love it if we could spend a little time with 6 people that know their stuff to talk about, and I don't want to limit to this. One of the things that's always fascinated me about yacht design, it's true of other capitalistic operations too, it's a mixture of capitalism and art, who gets the credit? Now, this has been discussed here and very well, and it's been done. Olin took credit, but he gave credit, but he didn't like the star system very much. He didn't like to, people didn't get it. He didn't get people's names set up in lights when they did something special. It was assumed that they would do good work. That was the nature of working for S&S. But I remember Hank Yulee very, very bitter in his old age. Now, maybe he was just bitter because he was old. I don't know. I can understand that. It's not hard to understand at all. What are the rewards of working? Do you ever want, well, there's David Pedrick. Do you ever want to be on your own? What are the constraints? What is it like to be on your own as opposed to working in a large or middle-sized corporate practice? What's the, could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, and just to check, are you picking up the microphone?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Well, now, I wonder if you are. Can you all hear? If you can all hear David, it's all fine.
Okay. One big difference of the large company versus the smaller, more or less independents, is that somebody has to bring in the business. And in small offices, those of us that are doing that have to also be the principal salespeople. With the big company, it was a more traditional situation of employees who were expert draftsmen and who would come in on the train from Long Island or wherever, and they'd do work on these beautiful creations. And it's a very satisfying artistic creativity field. So I think that there was satisfaction, and there was good harmony in the office. I mean, it was the spirit of S&S and the creativity and the quality and the excitement of the successes of what happened. I think there was a lot of professional satisfaction to be had by coming in and just doing that job. You mentioned Mario Tarabacchia, one of the unsung heroes of the company. Mario had come over from Trieste long before I had started there, lived in a community out in Long Island where Italian was the language of the community. And he'd come into S&S and he'd work on this. And he had this wonderful smile and sparkle in his eye. And he drew most of the America's Cup boat lines and a number of other really premier projects. And he really had that eye that was fantastic. And so with America's Cup projects, he and I worked pretty closely together. It was just a wonderful working relationship. And so with Courageous, when Courageous was launched, I was just barely 26 years old and still kind of knew what was going on with some of the ways S&S worked. And naively, I'd been project managing the construction and then off to sea trials. And I invited Mario to go for a sail on Courageous on one of her early sails. And he was so overwhelmed because no one in the 15 years or so that he had worked at S&S had ever invited him to actually go out and sail on one of the boats. I mean, it's just the way it worked. And also people were happy doing their jobs there.
Yeah. Others, some other.
This was taboo.
I'm not talking about salaries now.
No, well, that's another taboo. But I'm just talking, when I first arrived at the office, bouncing from table to table, trying to understand what was going on, one of the questions I would often ask is, were you sailing this weekend, or what boat do you sail on? No one in the office sailed. And I was completely flummoxed. I was like, let me get this straight. I'm at SNS, and there's not one person here going sailing this weekend. The head of the design team, Bill Mavrionis, never sailed, hadn't been on a boat maybe ever. I didn't know when. And here he is on the phone banging the thing down because the drawings didn't get to, England for the Prime Minister's, deck plan, and he's banging, and I'm wondering to myself, this guy doesn't sail. But so I started trying to invite people out sailing. Now, in the York Yacht Club crowd, there was Bill Steiger, and Bill Steiger and Frank Kinney. I think they took the train together, and Bill Steiger sailed a fair amount on Tempest and with the Googleman family and others out there. Frank didn't enjoy sailing that much, but
Frank Kinney?
one of the things that I tried to provide here a little bit for the show today was to list the names of some of the boats that were on the drafting tables when I walked in the office. And I invite anybody here, I'm not as good as you all at computers, but go look up a boat named Jack Aranda, look up Saga, look up Yankee Girl Charisma. Any of that era of boats, those were all drawn by Frank Kinney on his board, and they were lethal. They were some of the most wonderful boats of their time. I brought a picture of Charisma at the start of the Channel race. It's been in my basement for 40 years. My wife loves it. But Olin's aboard. I wanted to make a couple of comments. Olin was a fabulous sailor, and I sailed a fair amount with Olin. I would invite him to go, and many times, if it was possible, he would join us. What's fascinating, his thing about crews, he loved a good gang. He called it a gang. That was he said, you have a good gang here, that was his thing. He loved the camaraderie and the spirit of a good gang of guys pushing a boat hard. He loved, Paul was mentioning how he really liked it when a boat was pushed hard. But what's forgotten is celestial navigation. So Rod and Olin were both master mariners in that regard. Rod was a master celestial navigator. He taught it to anybody that wanted to learn it anytime, anywhere. He was extraordinarily good at it. I guess the point I'm trying to get to is that the sailing in the office was not the thing on the weekends. And it was funny for me. David and I ended up doing a lot of sailing together. I started having David help me get boats ready to go racing, and he was willing to do it on the side, and that proved to be a very successful formula. But we never took any of the draftsmen. We really never got them to go. I think they were afraid to show up also. I think there was the voodoo zone there where you don't accept those invitations. Yeah. You don't go near the customer. The thing that Rod, I had better notes, and I'm sorry I choked a little bit, but the things about the company that I've reflected on in the past after leaving is the brand. It was SNS first, not accolades to anybody that created it. It was the team's work that was out there, and it was under the brand of SNS. And it was the fact that it was performance, and performance speaks volumes in the marketplace. And then it was all of these details about what made their boat and brand separate and different from, and it was really a combination of those things that kept the company alive and current. If you look at a chart of the, sort of the geopolitical economic cycles over the long stretch of competitive existence of the firm, it's really amazing. They started in a depression.
Yep.
Their first boat was built for them because their father had to find something for these two boys to do that had dropped out of school. And, he got them on the water and got them busy, and that order must have been gold to Miniford or Nevins. Do anybody remember Miniford's or Nevins?
Nevins.
Durade, Miniford or Nevins?
Nevins.
It was Miniford.
I think it's Miniford.
It was cheap.
I think it's Miniford.
It was
I think it's
inexpensive.
Miniford. But
The cheapest going.
the two yards were beside each other, and But Rod always spoke very highly of all the time he spent with customers' boats at Nevins. A lot of his detail and everything came from the gang at Nevins that knew woodworking, and all of the details on the deck and everything were things that he learned there.
This raises a point that is, I think, worth going into a little bit. And I'm looking at Halsey and realizing it's directly to the point. Among the many things that made Herreshoff Manufacturing Company so extraordinary was N.G. Herreshoff and John Herreshoff and the building crew. It was a vertical, I guess it's vertical, whatever. It did everything. It designed the boats, it built the boats, it made the sails, it did the whole thing. And I would submit that probably financially over time it was a very good arrangement. It was at least it was from the 70s till 1920.
They had periods where the company was doing extraordinarily well, and then it would go into quiet times.
The business cycles are terrible in this business.
Well, I might build a little bit on that, Louis, and on what Andy just said. I think it's a great help for a yacht designer to also be a good sailor. You know, when my grandfather designed all those America's Cup boats, in one case, the syndicate leaders were dissatisfied with the captain they'd hired. So they asked Captain Nat, would he take the helm? Well, they went right out and won the race big time. He ended up sailing the boat the whole rest of the America's Cup of 1893, including some very challenging races. Well, similarly, Olin and Rod were great sailors. And my understanding of that about Olin comes from two things. He was the navigator of Columbia that I was the bowman on in 1958. And
At 15 years old.
he was a great member of that afterguard. And the other thing is what Rod had told me many times in our conversations in the cabin of Mustang, that he said that Olin was the best person he'd ever known to get speed out of a boat. And, you know, they were both, as has been referred to a couple of times, very much detailed men. And I remember one time that early summer, I was a disciple of Rod, and I did all the things he wanted for when I was the bowman. And one of the things he wanted to do was he wanted to cut down the windage on the mast when we were going to windward, so that we, as soon as we got ready to come on the windward leg after a run, we would bring down some of the halyards and send up a little tiny messenger, thin messenger. And I didn't mind doing that. It was all part of the routine, no problem. But I wondered whether it made any difference. So one time I went to Olin and I said, you know, we run up these little messengers so we cut down the windage on the halyards going to windward. Do you think, Olin, that really makes any difference? Well, his answer was so great and so classic. He said, well, you know, maybe not. Maybe it doesn't really matter. But he said, if we can do 100 things like that, we're going to win the America's Cup. And so that was a good expression of the fact that they were into detailed things. One thing, though, that also happened there, I'll tell you, it's a little bit of a story on myself. You speak about Rod and Olin and how they were with the office, and they were sitting there, always great gentlemen. But they really were wonderful with crews. And people like Reese Potts, who admired Rod. Rod brought him on. And I think for so many of our contemporaries, not only a lot of what we knew about sailing comes from these two special gentlemen, but I think a lot of the spirit of it and the objectivity of what we do comes from these two gentlemen. And one thing I was just going to mention in passing is one time when this time came to put the messenger up, I was around the mast with Rod. And Rod never made a mistake, ever. Everything was right. So he started unloosening the halyards, and I glanced at it and I said, Rod, no, not that. That's the spinning halyard. He says, no, not the spinning halyard. And he looked up and it was. So after that, whenever we came to an event like this, Rod would always say, Halsey did save me once when we were on the run in the America's Cup. I didn't let go of the spinning halyard and have it go in the water in front of the boat.
Oh, God. This might be a good moment. I had this in my original plan, and then I dropped it, and I want to put it back. And this will take a little bit of thought, but you're all thoughtful individuals. And I'm trying to think of the number. I think I would ask each of you to tell me your 3 favorite S&S designs. And I'm not concerned whether they're the most successful, the most performance-wise, or the most beautiful, the most storied. I would assume you take Stormy over Dorade, but maybe I'm wrong. But just be prepared. Just don't throw it out. Give it a fence. And I just start with Paul and go around. And we can have a minute or two, all of you, to think this thing through. I know it's a tough question. But the 3 best S&S designs from 1929 to 2018.
Well, I'll go first. Obviously, emotionally, Dorade means a lot because I've sailed a lot on her, and the fact that she was such a delightful boat to sail. I remember when Mike Toper got on board, when Edgar Cato bought the boat, and he started tightening things up and tightening shrouds up. And, you know, I always bowed to the guys who know a lot more than I do, but I went up to him and said, listen, this is like a DC-3. She likes to breathe. Let her go. Because we were starting to break stuff. But she wasn't Olin's favorite boat. He was asked the question at a do we had over here at the fort one time, and the new owner was quite astonished that Olin didn't say she's my favorite boat. I think Running Tide and Dorade are my top 2, but I have to think about the third.
All right, so since I want 3, your favorite S&S powerboat?
The next one.
All right, I'm going to show my hand. I had a favorite S&S powerboat, and it was Porpoise. Do any of you remember Porpoise? A blue 55-foot.
Burger?
Hmm?
Burger.
I don't think was she built by Berger? I think it was Jacobson, actually.
Really?
Built around 1935, 34, maybe Berger. But she was absolutely beautiful, painted deep navy blue, deeper blue, just as blue as can be. And she had an all-black crew, black skipper, black mate, black sailor. And she would come into Padenham Harbor, and she simply was beautiful. I did find out she apparently was a terrible roller. She rolled. But that's part of design. Jim, 3 favorites.
This is a very difficult question for me because
You can take more time if you want. I mean, I don't want to.
No, I'm not going to take more time. I'll just do 2 votes,
Okay.
something like that. I mean, I grew up in an era where a number of the boats that you fellows were working on were the beautiful, dominant boats of the day. And that's where my aesthetic came from. And even though I've been more of an analyst than an aesthetician, to me, the proper answer for that really is aesthetics. If I wanted to look at numbers, my favorite design would be the one that got the most thoroughly investigated in a towing tank and CFD and so on, because it gave me the most chance to explore. But let's just drop that. On the aesthetic side, my era was not the aesthetics that I grew up with. And so I would go back to the era of those that preceded me. I think the most memorable boat I've seen is Bolero. Wow. But I could probably add some others in as well, but I'll just throw that one out there.
That's beautiful. And very appropriate, given our setting here today. David?
Okay, well, looking at some, at least to some extent, some years, of the 1930s glory days of S&S, Dorade, as remarkable as she was, and Olin admitted that she was a bit too narrow. And Stormy Weather was one of the boats that, having learned what he did from Dorade that wasn't right on the mark, that he went on and developed and came up with an even more successful boat, I guess, on the race course. And it's characteristic of Olin that he was always thinking of the next thing. The whole idea of somebody who's copying you is behind you. He was always thinking of what to do next, and was never, with his intellectual honesty, smug at all about, no matter how great a boat was, that was the last, a recent boat, and he was already on to other things. So the next one that I would pick up would be, I would share Running Tide. on that she evolved after Intrepid, and as I understand, a lot of the Intrepid crew were part of what drove Running Tide to become this flush deck, really serious, flat out racer for her day. And so she had a beautiful hull, the new age of the separated rudder, a very efficient deck plan, and an extremely successful racing career, and she was much loved. I would say that would be another thing. S&S boats are boats that people love. And I must say that's one of the things that I think I tried to learn from Llewellyn in my career, is to design boats that the owners and the crews and successors and people look at them will love. And that's a quality that's intangible, but is in the essence of S&S. And then I would move on to a boat that I'll have to be maybe less than humble about, but with Llewellyn always being willing to try new things and to trust in the people who are in the design team, I was given the opportunity to develop a new breed of maxi boats for the firm when I was there. They were starting out to just warm over CCA kinds of big boats, and that wasn't what the Times and the Iowa Rule and the other things were doing. So there were two maxis, Tempest and Kilo 3, that I got to basically create there. And it used Running Tide's hull as the parent hull. It used VPP prediction methods. It looked around, and one of the boats that was sensational at the time was the Ketch Equation, with a very tall mizzen ketch rig. So I picked out elements that from the various sources, and Llewellyn gave a very long leash to develop these projects. And Kilo 3 went on to be the World Ocean Racing Champion for 3 years, and all kinds of records and everything else. And so she was a revolutionary kind of boat that reflects Llewellyn's willingness to use the science, use the observation of what other people were doing that maybe S&S wasn't doing so well, and put the package together. So there's a photograph of her in the back there with all the rags flying, back when there were bloopers. You find the spinnaker on one side and then have a sort of free-flying blooper out the other side, plus the mizzen spinnaker. There are 5 sails up in there when we were setting the course record in the Sydney Hobart race that lasted for 20 years. So, okay.
It's a good response. Brendan?
Yeah, I think it's a tough one. I think there's, you limit it to 3, but there's so many different avenues the company's gone down over the years, from military boats to sailboats to powerboats. It's hard to pick.
You gonna pick the duck?
I'd say, that's what I'm going to say, kind of ingenious and novel designs. The duck hasn't been
Olin
it's a phenomenal-
autographed a duck.
Well,
At a classic boat show I was at. It was, he had the biggest smile on his
Yeah.
face, and he took the pen and he put his name on it.
Unbelievable piece of engineering, for a yacht design firm to develop.
Maybe,
something like
I'm not sure everyone knows about the duck. Could give it a little.
that. I mean, maybe
I
somebody
can
else
give
has
a
better
little- I can give
perspective
a
on
little-
the duck.
Well, Rod told me a lot about those things, that they found that need in the war, and they did invent the whole thing.
So
And
amphibious truck.
It was an amphibious truck, and it was used for landings and all. And it was so important that General Eisenhower gave Sparkman Stevens, particularly Rod, a big award for that, and said that they felt it was one of the most important things in the D-Day landings.
They're still doing, seeing
They're
service
still
in
doing
Boston.
the tours in Boston
the
and
tour-
everywhere else.
On the street.
But the thing that Rod was so proud of there was that in the specification from the government to the firm was that an 18-year-old that didn't have a driver's license had to be able to operate the vehicle, and that was his. And so
He made it that way.
and Rod had to figure out how to make these gear shifting levers and pedals and clutches and everything go from road vehicle to seaborne, propulsion, and then back again. And it had to be able to drive in deep sand and then on a highway. And So he solved a whole
Yeah.
raft of problems.
Yeah, that's
It was
amazing.
Terrific, terrific.
I think most impactful would have to be DeRaid. I mean, I don't know if the
Okay.
firm would exist without that boat being as successful as she was.
There is a point I want to make about, out of fairness to Starling Burgess, whose relationship with Olin was close but complicated, and it wasn't all that close. It was very respectful. But does anyone, you remember, you don't remember the boat, I'm sure, know of the boat Advance? The Advance, the schooner Advance, does that ring a bell? The Advance was an 80-plus foot schooner that was designed by Burgess in 1924 for a guy named Lawrence, who was a tremendous sailor, just a tremendous, interested in the technology of sailing and everything else. And she was built to be a competitive statesman schooner, racing around the buoys and doing all the things you do in the York Yacht Club cruise and, you know, what high-end yachting in the 20s. And she was built in Scandinavia and sailed over here. And she was nothing but a meter boat. That's all she was. And she was unbeatable. And there is no question at all that in my mind, it can't be any, that her ability to cross the Atlantic without any particular problem, there was terror in those days about the idea of a meter boat type, an international rule boat sailing offshore. It didn't seem safe or feasible. But somehow Rod had been aware of it, and Olin, particularly Olin, and it does seem, to me anyway, that the germ of DeRaid, a long, skinny, basically a meter boat, very different from an Olin type boat, that was the germ of it. It doesn't take anything away from the design of DeRaid, but she didn't come out of a vacuum, is all I'm saying. Response? Anyone want to say how long?
Yeah, I don't know. It's interesting. I mean, I consider DeRaid more of an ocean racing boat. I'd say that the class boats, the other boat then would be Ranger, and then developing into all these 12 meters. I mean, it's kind of a different design approach, I think.
Well, I think it's more just the idea of a high aspect, you know, a tall rig, narrow
boat,
deep. They was considered too wet. When the 10 meters came down, that were also a very famous one design class, came down from Halifax, they were going to be towed down to Boston. And that was also well known to Olin. I think Olin was on one of them, actually. As a matter of fact, I'll slide over from Advance to the 10 meters. And they were leaving Halifax, and a tremendous gale came up, and the tow couldn't handle it, so they were on their own. They had absolutely no problem at all. Sailed down to Boston and didn't put any water on the deck at all. So all I'm saying is an interesting link there. So DeRaid is still you're sticking with it, all right?
Yeah, I think so. I don't know if the company would be where it is without
It
DeRaid.
wouldn't.
Yeah, definitely wouldn't be there. On the powerboat side, there's a whole group of powerboats that are very interesting that aren't looked at. Like Scarlet O'Hara is a boat probably nobody's ever heard of. I think it was R.J. Reynolds. There's a whole group of cruising powerboats that are beautiful. That I think are.
They always seem to me to represent the most healthy kind of powerboat compared to the competition.
Yep.
Bring back more of them.
Yep. And then Bolero I love. I have a Planet Bolero hanging in my house. And I think she's beautiful.
Not Verona?
Represents everything. It's a very similar boat. I mean, I'd put them in
Bolero
the same group, yeah.
Okay.
And had a lot of impact on the new design we just did in Holland. That's actually Bolero and Aileen are next to each other at the Newport shipyard right now. So the latest design in the water and Bolero. It's a great thing to see. Till tomorrow morning.
Wow.
Yeah.
Halsey.
Well, this discussion has led me to think of a few other things about what Olin and Rod did. You know, besides the conception of a new idea, the engineering, the development and the performance of the boat, the main thing that an engineer needs is objectivity. And in all the discussions with Olin, he was always completely objective. And I think, David, you can attribute to that too. That he was just as willing to criticize his own work as he was the work of anybody else. All he really cared was for the truth. And I think that's an absolutely essential for a yacht designer or from anybody that works in innovation and top flight engineering. The other thing is that Olin was, of course, completely fair, and he didn't want to take any credit he didn't have. And one of the proofs of that is, you know, for a long time, it was a great mystery who really designed the final lines of Ranger. It was a secret, and I don't know whether they made a pact with each other, but they were both such, Starling Bridges and Olin Stevens, they're both such real gentlemen that if they once shook their hand and said they weren't going to say whose design it was, they would stick to that. And it was only long after Starling Bridges' passing that Olin came forward one time and he said, actually, the model for Ranger was the design of Starling Bridges. Well, probably that was more self-effacing than reality because they did a lot of communicative work and model testing. And the truth of it is probably that it might have been 55% Starling Bridges and 45% Olin Stevens, but he didn't say that. He just said it was Starling's design. So you want me to say what?
Well, just
boat I
the
like?
three, any three S&S boats that you think are
Easy.
pretty.
Of all the Sparkman Stevens boats I ever sailed on, the Freedom is a champion. America's Cup boat, Freedom. Low freeboard, modest, nice proportions, great rudder,
Good.
terrific gear, and we won every race but one. So that's
I think
the
you
best
have the
boat.
right.
Yeah.
And Andy?
That's a hard one for me because I didn't get to sail a lot of the older designs. So just, you know, the stuff in my era, I had preferences for. So I'd prefer to say that picking up on people's stories because Paul loved Running Tide. It's been mentioned several other places here. Hank Yule's name has come up. So if you'll indulge me, I'll tell a quick story. Hank Yule did nothing in our office except Berger power boats. He had never drawn a sailboat. The Admiral's Cup was on in '71. We had of 11 nations, that's 3 boats a nation, 33 boats on the line. We had 30 were new Sparkman Stevens designs. I'd call that pretty much total domination.
Boy.
If you think that each country probably had 4 or 5 new boats that didn't make it on the team, then you get an idea of the amount of volume that was going through the office when I arrived. It was like crazy. So in '60, so this would have been back up because, you know, you don't place the order, you don't get the boat the same day. So go back to like 1968. Olin gets a call from a very prestigious customer, Mr. Esbranson, and he was a shipping magnate, and he had found a young man and a family with some money in Holland that wanted to start a boatyard. And they offered him an extremely low starter kit price. If he could just get the lines plan immediately, they would handle it from there. And it was in guilders. I remember seeing the quote. It was like, you get, if the hull, the structural foundations for the, you know, the skin and the ribs and the keel and all of that, you get the rudder port and a keel. I don't remember the fairing, whether or not there was fairing on it, but it wasn't painted. It was rough. Because it went to Kritzer's and that's where you met.
Houseman built it.
No, well, okay, you took my line, you turkey.
But they've been in business for 50 years prior to that.
This was the first design.
First aluminum
This
boat.
was the first
aluminum
aluminum
Oh, I thought
boat
you
they
were
had
talking
ever
about-
done.
I thought you were talking about a startup boat.
No, that was the first aluminum boat. They wanted to.
You want to take this outside,
They
boys?
wanted to
We will.
They wanted to transition to this new, you know, after the war
Wow.
aluminum stuff. But he had to have the drawing in those days, you know, you took a courier and you put it in a pouch at JFK and the guy flew, you know, and then got in a car and drove it to the had to be there, you know, Monday at midnight or whatever. It's Thursday or Wednesday when he's getting this call from. So he goes to Hank Yule on like Thursday and he says, Hank, I've got to draw this boat. I think it's going to be about 60 feet long. We've got to get it done. Would you consider working the weekend? And so Hank, who didn't draw one Admiral's Cupper, not one ocean racer, never drew a sailboat in his freaking life, did nothing but these beautiful Berger power boats, one after the other, by the way, beautiful boats. Drew Running Tide on a weekend. He was a chain smoker.
What a story.
He was a chain smoker, so his hands were like tan, you know. And I think it must have been 18 packs of Camels. And the sepia that you can get in the archives today is just eraser marks everywhere. And it went in the pouch on Monday night, and it was delivered Tuesday in Holland, and that became Running Tide. So it's got a little bit of everybody in it. And I'll just wrap it up here quickly. In the lunches, in the famous lunches, I would be rotating around doing this, that, and the race here, race there, different boats, different designs, big boats, little boats. And I'd come back and we'd have lunch and they'd ask, how'd you do, blah, blah, blah. There's a bunch of pictures of boats here I raced. And I'd tell them what I thought was good and what I thought was bad. And every time I came back, and I was racing some nice boats. I raced on Yankee Girl. I raced on, if you look up Charisma, just go Sparkman Stevens Yacht Charisma on your Google as you're going to get drinks tonight, and you'll see a picture of what I was handed at 26 years old. I mean, it was freaking lethal. And, we won everything, represented the United States twice on Admiral's Cup teams, blah, blah, blah. So here I am in the office at lunch saying there's something about this Running Tide, I don't know what it is. And what it was, I think, and Olin, I think, came to this, but we had this heated debate for the full 6 years. This didn't end at one lunch. This went on and on and on. Because you remember, the boat had two lives. It was the original life with the short rig, and then they put 15 feet or 12 feet or some gob number on the top of the mast, and the boat took off again and started winning again for another 5 years. And the boat was drawn at the end of the CCA era, at the early stages of the IOR rules. And the owner asked the design office, I want a meter boat in the ocean. So you can see all these stories you're talking about. And that was his instructions to the office. I want an ocean going 12 meter. And so he got it. And what he got was a boat that had sort of a CCA counter. It had the Intrepid 67 underbody. It had, some of Frank Kinney's very slab-sided boats, which he was drawing at the time. I don't know where Hank came up with this bow, but it was sort of board-sided from the chain plates to the stem. I had a raging argument with Olin over that. It's not that, Andy. It's not straight, And then he'd take me to the office and we'd roll out to raid, and well, the waterline's identical, Well, okay. So anyway. The bottom line was it was picked by Olin in his book, and 40 years later I was reading this book and he selected it as his best all-around yacht design. So that's a little history of that's a little history of a boat that won its class in Bermuda race at least 2 times, and a million other races.
This is great.
Sorry.
Now it's now 5. We're doing extremely well. Let's stay.
My wife, she's heard that story 82 times.
Let's stay on the winning course here. And I suggest that we say 5:15 is it. If anyone is tired, they can leave now. But can I keep you going for another few minutes? There's one
There's a smart man.
general topic that would be fun to deal with, and I wasn't going to do it because there wasn't going to be time. We have talked about S&S, but you can't really talk about S&S without talking about the competition. And I would love just to see, I have no agenda here, and I don't really have anything in mind. I was very close in my odd young way to Francis Herreshoff. And his relationship with Rod was 0. They disliked each other very, very much. And I was raised that S&S was the devil incarnate. Well, they weren't. And that was a real shock to me to learn, having met Olin and getting to know him, that he was not the devil. But let's not forget that there was a time when Al Francis was a major, major figure in American yacht design, and he still is. Phil Rose, pretty extraordinary guy, pretty amazing, some of the boats he designed. Herman Fayette, I don't know anymore, I know nothing about this, except I'm fascinated how, when you, as designers at S&S or within your experience as former S&S people or current S&S, how do you deal with the company? How do you figure it out? Do you say, Jesus, it looks like Gary Mull has done it again. How do we get the lines plan out of his secretary? How do you do it? How do you fight that battle? How do you stay abreast? How do you beat the competition?
I guess I might be the likely suspect to
Yes,
start
David,
that.
that's a good way to start.
That because this period of the 70s was revolutionary. This incredible success of S&S and up to the Admiral's Cup that Andy was referring to, and about one or two more biennial editions of that where S&S dominated. But the conservatism of how a lot of the company functioned. I mean, Olin was always looking to the next thing, but the truth of the matter is the company was churning out a lot of designs that were incremental changes from the scores that had recently been done before. The new breed of designers that came in were younger, fresher. There was a new rule, and so they read the rule and they said, you know, there's a point measurement here and a point measurement there and a point measurement there, and how tightly can you wrap a shape around those points and do other things, the trapezoidal keels, fin keels, and other things which were part of having a shallow bottom diorama boat. So there were things going on with the rule that Olin helped create, and the science of fin keels and separate rudders that was just cracking through, and new designers that took this fresh look. So I think that what went on there was a lot of other designers made bigger steps more quickly in what the IOR permitted than what the inertia of the S&S office could keep up with. So we had a few special projects that we got to do that were bigger steps than the normal projects that were going on. So I think that looking around and seeing what other people were doing was really essential during that time. And you know, there was this shaggy-haired guy from San Diego who came up with a budget boat from a kind of rough and tumble builder out there that went out and cleaned everybody's clock in '73 and '74 and so with Ken Barry and Doug Peters. And then Ron Holland had found his way up here from New Zealand, and you know, they like nice light boats down in New Zealand, and so some of that mentality went into the competition. And Herman was a bit more in the conservative mode and the Sparkman and Stevens kind of culture, but he also was able to make steps rapidly enough to catch the wave. So I think that was, I'd have to admit that's part of why I left the company.
So maybe the success, the power and success of S&S in a way was an impediment.
Yeah, that the inertia
Rigidity of
there
thinking
was
about
difficult, and I was in charge of research and development and got to do some nice projects, but there are other things that just weren't happening rapidly enough.
And consistent in carrying on, and it's a little bit further because I'm again looking for something. Real innovation, real breakthrough. I'm honestly, I'm a real fan of S&S, and I always have been. But I don't think of S&S as a real breakthrough designer other than Doré. I think of them as incrementally always improving, always a little faster than anyone else. I think that Francis Herreshoff, Ray Hunt, I'm a Ray Hunt person, obviously, to a degree. Ray was all over the lot guy, completely intuitive, but really the deep V, you can go on with Ray quite a long way. That wasn't Olin's way at any rate. He wasn't looking to reinvent for an explosion. He was looking to improve. Am I right or am I wrong?
Well, you'd have to look at Intrepid as a breakthrough boat for S&S. But backing up a couple steps from there, the California came out way before that with a canoe-type light California thinking hull and trapezoidal keel and I forget what the spade rudder there too. And some of the S&S boats with keel-hung rudders were getting smaller and smaller keels and were wiping out like crazy. And Pat Haggerty with the head of Texas Instruments and Bay B had one of these boats, and that actually I think got the aft-hung rudder before Intrepid. But these were things that were going on in more clear-cut ways with some other designers. I mean, Bill Lapworth in that case, and Intrepid and Bay B and even Running Tide were a blending of that kind of modern, crisp, kind of sharp edge thinking with the smooth, curved, linear kind of stuff that S&S was in. So as far as competitors go, give credit where it's due. There were things that were going on that made a lot of sense if you took a fresh outside look at it. And S&S was a little slow in the upgrade.
Go ahead.
I'd like to expand on what David is saying. I've worked on handicap rule development and I've worked in a rating office for a number of years. So I see all the actual designs that are coming in, the latest contemporary racing boats. I see what the designers are doing for hull shapes, other aspects of design. If I back up for a second, when I joined there, David was using the word inertia, and I think that just goes with the fact that people have a life cycle, and they know what has worked, they know what their values are, and they stick to those, and change becomes a little bit hard. Now, Owen was perpetually intellectually curious about things, and we could talk for quite a bit about what he did after he retired. But if I set that aside, one example was, Rod felt a proper boat had a bilge that collected water. And a boat that was flat, the water, if there were water, would drift off to the side where it did not belong. So boats should have a certain amount of V to them so that the water would collect in the bilge and you could pump it out. And there was resistance in the office to do what, for instance, the Iowara loved, which is a very flat boat in the middle. But that was anathema to Rod. And it contradicted his value scheme of what a proper boat was. But going back to the other point I wanted to make is things change all the time. You do a new kind of structural engineering, new materials, it changes everything. Now you can support a bulb very deep, and you can come up with a boat that's much lighter for its stability. Or a rule change comes out, and it takes nimble thinking to think, what does this rule look for? So when I look at the boats that come across my computer screen, I see like another trend. We get light boats, they're very fast downwind. In fact, they sort of behave like catamarans. So their optimum downwind angles are very hot. These boats heel over all the time. We call it apparent wind sailing, but the upright lines become much less important than what the boat is shaped like heeling over. And I've seen some of the most contemporary successful designers, everything seems to be, what does this boat look like when it's heeled 15 degrees? I don't give a crap what it looks like upright, but when it's over 15 degrees, I want this thing to be able to plane. So depending on the nature of the boat, displacement length ratio and draft and how much stability it has, it dictates a completely different set of lines. So I think life always encourages ingenuity, seeing what the game is, thinking out of the box. And we all tend to follow what is successful. But you get turnover because people come in with new out-of-the-box thinking, looking at what's going on. So life supports ingenuity.
Yeah.
Nothing wrong with Sparkman and Stevens, but new people with new ideas, different perspectives. It's not the baggage of the old, it's less inertia.
That's fascinating. Well, now we're right at the edge of over. So I wrote this before you guys had all hung, so it's a little bit over the top itself. But as we lurch to the end of this Sparkman and Stevens marathon, and fully mindful of the 1,001 important topics we've not yet touched on, I ask you all to consider, and we've already done this, but I'm going to say this again. I ask you to consider the world of yachting and yacht design that the future seems to hold. A world in which trapeze festoon, foiling multi-hulls and monohulls, 500-foot mega yachts, and 90-knot picnic boats are commonplace and unremarkable, and conventional cruising racing sailboats in the classic S&S mold are rare as unicorns. Is this really the path forward for the sport we all love? Maybe. How best can S&S and all yacht designers of goodwill keep alive the values and traditions that Olin and Rod's life and work exemplified? And Brendan, you really have already spoken to that, but could you speak one more to it and others too?
Yeah, and I think we touched on it a little bit with what Jim just said. I mean, I think the world is changing. I mean, I think 500-foot motor yachts to some people is the most exciting thing in the world. And it's just a different world. I think there's a lot to be said for foiling catamarans, but I think you're looking at the advancement of things on the water going fast with wind power. That's the best we've done so far.
Pretty basic.
But people that are used to ocean sailing boats and race boats from 50 years ago, it's hard to find common ground.
It's impossible in some cases.
Maybe, yeah. Hard for a lot of people to find common ground.
So keep your eyes wide open and keep moving forward.
Like Jim just said, always, ingenuity will reign.
Do I have a ratification from the rest of the board?
Well, Halsey and I always enjoyed talking about reliance when we had time in the cockpit or whatever. And so I would say there's a benchmark from one iteration of time, and now maybe we as a panel, or certainly some of us older folks here, represent another iteration, and maybe what was just referred to about the way people are going to see the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years will be the next iteration. But it would be hard to say that Reliance wasn't dazzling in every aspect of her engineering and what it took to sail her, you know.
She was fantastic.
I for one, have been arguing this recently because I've sailed for the last 15 years in the 12-meter class again. So I sailed from the time I was 25 years old till 70 years old in the class. And all the young people throw stones at you for, what are you doing that for? That it's an antique. My God, you're coming together at 7 knots. Big deal, you know. I've been stoned every which way, mostly by my family members, my brothers and stuff. But the truth of the matter is, and I would hope Halsey would agree a little bit with me, is that when you've got two boats sailing at, 67 or so degrees at each other at 8.5 knots, and somebody's got to duck and someone's got to decide to cross, that it's pretty freaking thrilling. And so, as Paul Luke said in Maine once to me when I was bragging to him about going 9 knots upwind at night on Yankee Girl, and he had been at this house on the mooring on Bolero at 19 years old as a crew member of Bolero. He said, Andy, I haven't changed the shape of the water much lately. Breeze is about the same. And I thought that was terrific because, that's about the way it is.
Well, Louis, just to comment on what's happening right now, I had an interesting reaction last evening. We raced one of my boats in the Wednesday night races in Bristol, and we were, usual thing, how you trim the sails and how you do the tactics, what you do. And as we went to the mooring, sailing pretty fast, what would come by but one guy on a little tiny boat with 3 hydrofoils, went by us about 20 knots, and he didn't think anything of it, and then he headed off and didn't collapse into the water, and came about, and it went off, took off. Well, I think we should welcome that. I mean, whatever is working is going to be something that can fascinate us and lead to improvements. But having said that, I agree with Andy that that didn't necessarily make the best racing. For instance, in the 12-meter boats, in the years that we had these wonderful competitions in Newport, 25 years of it, people like Dennis Conner developed great tactics where, for instance, if you were on starboard tack coming across and you had the right of way over the other 12-meter and he had to duck you, instead of just letting him duck you, we'd slam right in front of him. And there was an issue about whether that was okay with the rules, but we finally found a way to make it all right. You had to tack quick enough to get right on top of him. We called it a slam dunk tack. Well, now in New Zealand, in 2020 or 2021, with a yacht under their protocol, which is going to have a swing keel, if they do continue with that, and it's going to have hydrofoils, I don't think you're going to be able to have the virtues of yacht tactics.
People scraped off the other boat.
They're not going to be any slam dunk tacks and these great tactical
Good television,
choices that is what made the 12-meter yacht racing so great in Newport. You don't need a swing keel for a around the buoys race. You might need it to go around the world. And so there needs to be some practical moderation to the great things that are coming along.
And they will come by.
And they'll come because, as you say, the water doesn't change, the wind doesn't change, and some things are going to work and some things are going to fail, and then you go to the ones that work.
Well, gentlemen, David.
I would just comment that we've talked about some of this thrilling, exciting, leading edge stuff that's gone on, and between materials technology and the analytical kinds of things that Jim was referring to, and beyond that with computational fluid dynamics and modeling, there's been the ability to create these flying machines that is absolutely thrilling and attention-getting. But sailing is a pretty wide sport, and there are a lot of people that want to go messing about in a boat. And you've seen the M series and some of the other ones that are coming up here of just, lovely, more traditional, monohull boats where you can put people aboard that aren't hotshot sailors and guests that aren't sailors at all, and you can go out and have a nice time sailing around in more traditional kinds of boats. And for cruising with payload, these lightweight flying machines don't have much payload. You have to have only half a toothbrush and things like that in your kit when you're racing on them. And so covering the bases of what kinds of boats people like to sail has room for a lot more than just the gee whiz go fast stuff. And I think well done, more conventional monohulls that have comfortable cruising and payload capacity and traditional looks that people like.
Just the massive improvements on user interface.
Yeah.
Self-tacking, lifting keels for people that want to cruise in different spots. We're implementing a lot of that new technology in cruising boats. So it's not just racing boats.
Yeah, so you don't have to have the gee whiz stuff that's all the carbon fiber, lightweight, fragile stuff. Nice things going on with more conventional boats.
Yep.
Questions from the floor in a minute or two, three left? Yes?
Louis, good to see you again.
Donald,
Hey, Neil.
welcome.
I happen to be fortunate enough to be in Porto San Stefano on the island of Argentario when Olin was still alive, and they relaunched Dory. And he was a little late to the launching, and he walked around the corner and he saw his girlfriend at the time, Valeria. And it's quite something to see a man over 95 years old start running. It's this beautiful young 30-year-old to sweep her off her arm, give her a big hug. And then in the speech when they launched the boat about 10 minutes later, he said the thing that amazes him the most is that boats he designed to last 3 years, 5 years, 10 years are still being rebuilt again, and raced hard. And I think he was most impressed about that, at least when we were in Italy.
Yeah. These are boats that people love.
That's right.
That's
Exactly what you said.
there are people that want that.
Yes,
I have
sir.
a question. I'm curious about the partnership, because most successful partnerships are made up of two
kind of odd ducks that come together.
You know, a set of twins, major collaboration ends at birth. So what, how do they differentiate their responsibilities?
Rod and Olin were totally comfortable with each other and supportive of each other, and no, they wouldn't think of uttering a word of criticism of their brother. And I don't think they had to agree with everything, but they just were entirely compatible.
But they did have a
One more design and one was more business
Yeah,
oriented.
Well, they had different roles,
That's what I meant.
but there were two roles that needed to support each other. And when the margin came together, like Andy describes at the deck level, worked it out. But they were always absolutely fine people getting along with each other and having joy in what they did.
But there was the separation of powers, that the shear line was the DMZ. And so Olin would not interfere with Rod's decisions on rigs and things like that. And Rod kind of stayed out of the hull part. And so the two could meet at the interface without, bumping into each other.
And I admire that because the history of my own family is that Mr. J.B. Herreshoff and Nathaniel Herreshoff did not get along very well. It still worked fine, but it was nothing like the compatibility of Rod and Olin Stevens.
Well, I think then, I want to thank you very, very much. I want to thank, I guess I really should thank Clark and Jay and all the people that thought this up. Let's do it again. Let's go get a drink.
We're gonna try one more time on the video here before everyone leaves. And I do want to thank everyone for coming and invite everyone to the York Yacht Club afterwards.
And beauty that transcends technology. We know it can. We're Sparkman and Stevens. We've conceived, designed, drawn, and built some of the fastest, most renowned, and innovative machines the world has ever seen. But never once did we sacrifice beauty at the altar of performance, compromise innovation for the sake of tradition, or concede sophistication to the gods of fashion. Because we believe you never would either. At Sparkman and Stevens, we live by one unbreakable principle. It's your heart that beats in every yacht we design. Sparkman and Stevens, feel your heart race again.